Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the session on cross-browser layout and Internet Explorer 8. I want to start off by thanking everybody for coming. It's actually really exciting for me to be able to actually talk about Internet Explorer 8 that we've been building for a while. So this is going to be a good session. And I really appreciate you all coming to the session. It's kind of reaffirming that there's interest in the community to learn about Internet Explorer 8 and what we're doing in this next release. So I have to be honest, a couple of days ago, I wasn't really so enthused to give this particular talk. But I'm guessing that most of you kind of know by now that we've had kind of a shift, if you will, in our layout strategy for Internet Explorer 8. And so I am happy to say that beginning now with Internet Explorer 8, we will render standards content with our most standards mode by default, no opt-in. And so a lot of this talk is centered around that particular piece. So whenever I start talking about standards, I kind of draw a parallel to my own life. And so I live in Seattle, which is a pretty eco-friendly town. And there's a lot of push in Seattle to drive hybrid-type vehicles. And so, there's some push there that I can kind of withstand. Gas prices are high, but they're pretty much high everywhere across the U.S. And then there are some forces that, maybe are a little more difficult to withstand, like the fact that I actually want to be a good citizen and kind of reduce my carbon footprint. And also, the immovable object that is kind of my wife, who's like practically already picked out a Toyota Prius for me in the color. So the thing about the hybrid piece today is that, there's kind of several different emerging fuel standards, if you will. Like, there's hydrogen, there's solar power. Of course, that doesn't really work too well in Seattle. There's biofuel. So, quick show of hands here. How many of you know in your hometown where to go get biofuel or biodiesel? Okay. How many of you are planning on starting maybe a chicken farm or something to get your own chicken fat to power a car going forward? Oh, awesome. Thank you. We have one potential farmer in the room. So I guess the point there is that the thing about standards and trying to move a particular space forward is that all parties to that particular standard need to be bought in and on board with it. And so in the case of this, biofuel or biodiesel or whatever, like the car manufacturer needs to produce a car that would take biodiesel. Right? And then your Exxon and your Mobil, et cetera, your Amoco stations, they all need to serve you the biodiesel. And again, by the show of hands, most people don't even know where to get that at. And then the manufacturers themselves, like whoever's creating that energy source from scratch needs to be bought into, so there needs to be some type of system in place to create all this biodiesel that things might consume. And so bringing this back to kind of a discussion about the web, the thing here is that in the web space, there's kind of that three-part system as well. There's Internet Explorer and other browser vendors that need to be bought in and produce software that adheres to whatever standards we're talking about. Then there's the web server itself that's hosting the content that actually needs to speak that same language. And then there's you, the content authors, that need to write your site according to that particular standard. And so the thing to note about all of this is that, and I have this cheesy arrow at the bottom of the slide, but it really is a timeline, right? Like there's a piece that existed, before the standard. So, before people even thought about really these alternative fuel sources, there was a point in time. And then there's like the present where there's tons of talk about the particular standardization. And then there's kind of the future utopia where all parts of that system are on board with the standards piece. And so what really makes me excited about our discussion today in our new decision in Internet Explorer 8 is that you can kind of think of us as, the Ford, GM, Chrysler, et cetera, where we're producing that particular first component of that triangle. So we're producing the web browser, and by default, because we're going to operate in the most standard mode possible, it's kind of a forcing function, right? It helps to move this particular timeline forward because it provides that mechanism in box, and because it's default, you pretty much have to use it, or you should use it kind of going forward. And so I'll talk to that throughout the slide deck. let's see, assuming my forward button is going to work. So I want to start off here with a quick demo. So my name's Scott Dickens. I'm a lead program manager. I work on Internet Explorer. The team that I work on, we work on layout and rendering. We also own print and Zoom capabilities. So that's kind of my work persona. But in my private life, I'm a musician. And so I want to share with you my own story of pain and agony of developing for the web. Way back, this is kind of pre-MySpace days, pre-GarageBand days. If you were a musician and you were trying to get gigs or network, et cetera, you pretty much had to do it person to person. And so, with the emergence of the web, et cetera, everybody was really trying to get on board with creating their own website to kind of showcase their content, et cetera. And so I created this website. It's very similar to the one that I actually used. I removed some pictures just to protect the innocent. But I created this site specifically to work in Internet Explorer 6. And at the time that I created this site, in like 2002, et cetera, that's all I knew about. Like, I used Internet Explorer 6. Everybody else used Internet Explorer 6. I mean, that was the story. And so I never even thought, like, hey, maybe it should work differently in other browsers, et cetera. I designed my site using front page. Yes, I'm ashamed to admit that, but I did. And I published it to the web, and hey, life was great for a pretty long time. Eventually, though, I started getting complaints from friends or other people that I had told to go visit the site, et cetera, that, hey, it wasn't displaying correctly. And so, being the techie that I am, I get the repo steps, and it turns out that I need to install this other browser called Firefox. And then I can look at the site, and then it doesn't display the same way. So being the typical user that I am, as soon as I install Firefox, what's my first inclination? Oh, well, Internet Explorer's been around for a while, and my site was working fine in Internet Explorer 6. Now I install Firefox, it doesn't work. Hey, something must be buggy in Firefox, right? So I go searching the web to figure out what's wrong and figure out if it's a known bug or something like that, or other ways to kind of work around the problem. And it doesn't take a lot of searching to figure out that, boy, I was wrong. Like, Internet Explorer 6 is the one that's doing things wrong. Firefox is doing things correctly. And so, again, via my web searching, I figure out ways to actually fix my particular site so that it displays correctly in Firefox and in Internet Explorer 6. And so that's the page that you see here. And again, in Internet Explorer 6, it worked just fine. Again, life is good until Internet Explorer 7 releases. And so when Internet Explorer 7 releases, this is what my site looks like. And then I go, what the hell? And I curse Microsoft, even though I work for Microsoft. And so I'm looking through this, and again, I'm doing web searching to try to figure out what's wrong with my particular site. And so I'm sure most of you kind of recognize what this is right here. It was a hack that I got from the web that told me how I could work around particular browser problems in Internet Explorer 6. Well, it turned out when Internet Explorer 7 shipped, it was a little more standards compliant. My hack no longer worked. And so this is the way that my page is now displayed. It's like combining styles that were meant only for Internet Explorer 6, and now Internet Explorer 7 is processing them along with the other styles that are on the page. All in all, just badness. And so I resigned myself, screw it. I'm going to create the site once, and I'm going to create it correctly, and then I won't have this problem going forward, right? So again, I do some more research, et cetera, and I produce a new and improved, jazzier page that actually has the styles in the core main document flow kind of more targeted towards the Firefox experience, the more standard experience, if you will. And then I was using conditional comments to kind of pass styles to Internet Explorer 6 and Internet Explorer 7. And my page is perfect. It's good to go. And so the gist, I guess, of all of this particular story is that, it's not really a woe is me, poor Scott, I had to create my own little website. But it is to say that I do understand your pain. I do understand the pain that goes through creating a website and then making it work amongst a bunch of different browsers and then keeping it and maintaining it over time. Like, I get that. That's part of my pain you hear right there. Let's see if I can get the clicker going. Okay, cool. So this talk today is really about three things. It's about interoperability, it's about compatibility, and it's about the new features that we're enabling. And so this is kind of the prototypical, hey, what are you going to get out of this particular talk today? But I'm first going to talk about the new layout engine and its capabilities. Like, we've made some investments there. And those speak kind of to that interoperability piece. I'm also going to talk about some of the background about why we made the decision before the switch, if you will, and kind of our viewpoint after the switch and why that was made. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about version targeting and the meta tag, and it's not dead, and I'll explain kind of why it's not dead. But the key takeaway of all of this is that there is likely going to be an action item on your part to look at the sites that you maintain today and make sure that they continue to work well in Internet Explorer 8. And I'm going to give some examples of some real-world sites. Like, we always have these conversations, oh, what could possibly be broken with Internet Explorer? The next release comes out, and if it's more standards compliant, I will show you those breaks today. And I'm not trying to throw anybody on the bus. I apologize if I'm going to show sites that you actually work on, but it's just a conversation that things do break. So the first discussion is around our investment in layout. And so when we started the Internet Explorer 8 project, we looked at the set of spaces that we needed to tackle, especially in layout, and we said, okay, we understand what we have today. How do we get to where we need to be, both now in Internet Explorer 8 and then kind of going forward? So at the core of all of our technology piece is a component called MS-HTML. Internally, we call that Trident. So within Trident is a layout and rendering component. It does all the parsing, printing, yada, yada, yada. So we looked at that particular layout engine as it existed within Trident, and we said, does this get us to where we need to be in Internet Explorer 8 and in the future? The answer to that question was no. And so doing the kind of more typical Microsoft thing, we built something from the ground up. And there actually was reasoning behind it. We didn't think that the original engine could actually get us to where we needed to be. And the second is that I want to point out that we actually didn't start from complete scratch. There are other teams within Microsoft that have considerable expertise in the layout space, and we were able to re-leverage some of their technologies and focus it on web layout. The net of all this is that we get a platform that's better targeted towards typographic foundation, which I think is a real key because as we go forward, like, more and more of our content and our reading experience will actually happen on the web. Today, like, reading a term paper or a textbook or something like that on the web actually is pretty painful. And so, like, whenever I have to read a white paper or a technical doc, most of the time I resort to printing it out. Like, if it's a couple hundred pages, just because it saves my eyes and I can mark it up easier, et cetera. And we really see that reading experience going forward, moving more towards that online web experience. The second thing, and this was kind of discussed in an earlier talk, is that we actually had the CSS 2.1 spec in hand when we were designing this new layout subcomponents, which was a change, right? Like, that original layout engine had been carried forward from tons of releases of Internet Explorer. And so at the time that it was originally written, like, CSS 2.1 wasn't even thought about. And so it was kind of nice to actually have, oh, this is what our engine should do when we were actually building the engine from scratch. And then the third point here is that for those that are familiar, there's this internal piece mechanism, if you will, that we use within Trident to kind of do CSS layout, and that's this has layout functionality, where we designate blocks as basically having layout and other things that don't actually take up block format as not having layout. And that's how we kind of conceptualize and internalize the layout space. And so with this new particular engine, that has layout functionality is dead. And that's actually a really good thing because it was the source of most of the layout type bugs that you saw, especially around floats and stuff like that. So point there, we invested heavily in layout. The second piece here is that, okay, we need to put together some tenets for our release. The first of those is, as you see, better support for web standards. And then there was the question of, okay, what standards are we going to go after? In the layout space specifically, we targeted CSS 2.1. That's the most current, most complete of the layout specs, and it's the one that kind of has the most impact across the different browsers, and it's an area that we had, like, frankly, one of the biggest gaps between our current implementation in Internet Explorer 7 and the expectations and actual real code in other browsers. And so we created this brand new IE8 mode of the layout engine to do CSS 2.1 support. I want to kind of talk to that factoring off and also show that that mode, if you will, affects other components besides just layout. So there's some JavaScript components to that, there's some object model components to that, and I'll show those later when I show the breaking sites. And the JavaScript and OM components are specifically handled by a session tomorrow morning at like 10:30 or something like that. Okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about our progress to date. Again, we're building this engine from the ground up, and we're building support for CSS 2.1 from the ground up. Our goal is CSS 2.1 compliance across the board. And so measurement of that particular goal is a little hard, but along the way we actually have some milestones passed. And the first of those milestones is the ACID2 test. And so there was some scuttlebutt kind of before on the internet about, oh yeah, well you could render the test correctly, but only if you were opted in to this new standards mode. Again, with the change, by default, we show the ACID2 page correctly and we pass the test. And so, thank you. You're free to check this out on your own in your own build, but this is an IE8 build. Oh wow. Sorry. Let me refresh the page. That's a cross-site scripting thing, and so it had a cached copy of some of the I's when I did a refresh. So the page itself actually does display correctly, including the nose, et cetera. You can see that I'm actually at the Web Standards.org website. You can see that this is actually the true ACID2 test source. Like, I haven't modified it or monkeyed with it in any way. You can see that it even has its craziness around passing base 64 encoded strings and yada, yada. It is the test. So let's go to here. I do want to talk a little bit about what being done means. And so this is a hard question, and like I'll throw it out there. At the end of this particular project, our goal is 100% compliance, and there will probably be ways to nitpick and show that we actually didn't do that. And some of it's really not even nitpicking, some of it is legitimate. And so I want to talk to those challenges. The first is, how do you actually know that you're done? Like, how do you measure that you're done? And the way that we measure that we're done internally is that we'll have a set of goals for our project, and then we'll define scenarios for those, and then we'll define test cases that test against those scenarios. So if my scenario is, hey, I'm thirsty, and I want a drink, that's my goal, and my scenario is, I go to the fridge and I pour myself a glass of milk, and I bring it back and I drink it, then we have test cases to test all of those points along the way. And that's how we know that the scenario is actually complete and our goal has actually been met. In the case of CSS 2.1, we're looking for that same level of validation. And frankly, it just doesn't exist. So the body that helps produce this CSS 2.1 test, the test suite, actually admits this on the website. So when you go to the W3C site and you try to look for CSS tests and you like download the CSS test suite, like it says right in the release notes, hey, we recognize that the test is woefully incomplete. And so it begs the question of, okay, how do we know that we're actually done? And so we're kind of going about this in two different ways. The first is, we're putting together a set of tests. Those tests that we're using to validate our set of compliance, our interpretation of the spec, and then our implementation of it. And we're contributing that particular test back to the community. So it's a very open process that says, this is what we thought done looks like. These are the tests that we created in order to assess whether or not we're done or not. Give us feedback on that. Tell us if these are the right tests. Tell us if we're missing something. Tell us if we misinterpreted something, et cetera. So it kind of gives you that feedback mechanism that says, no, Microsoft, you're not done. You need to do X here. That's what's really important to me. And it also contributes back to the community so that other web browsers can use the test to validate their functionality as well. And so it improves kind of the whole community. And so we've already contributed 702 of these tests. They're available on MSDN right now, and they were submitted to the W3C under an open license. The second piece that we're doing around the test suite is that these aren't the only tests that we're using to validate compliance. There are another set of quote-unquote industry standard type tests, like the ACID2, there's other ones like that, that we're also using and running against our particular code base. Just another way that we're validating that we're actually doing the right thing. The second kind of part around, hey, how do we know that we're actually finished, is in the areas of ambiguity in the spec. And so whenever I say this to the non-web designer development community, people look at me and go, what are you talking about? It's a spec. It's got to be complete. And the conversation generally goes, the CSS spec is not a cookbook, right? As a browser manufacturer, I can't take that set of spec and like, oh, step 1, go get a cup of flour. Step 2, go get some eggs, and like put this together such that at the end of it, I have a browser that meets that spec. Like, it's not a cookbook. That's not the way that it works. It describes the language and the behavior, and then it's my job as the browser vendor to interpret that particular language and then build a browser that adheres to that language. And so when there are areas of ambiguity in the spec, it makes that difficult. And some areas of the spec are ambiguous on purpose, and some maybe not so much. So, a quick example here is just talking about positioning, relative positioning, and it just says, hey, we in the spec recognize you could probably do some stuff where you could set position relative on all these other things. We're just not going to define how that works, really. It's kind of up to you as the user agent, up to me as the browser, to do the right thing. Another example of this you may have seen in the keynote. So there are 2 different algorithms, if you will, to compute table width. The idea is that we need to know how wide a table is so that we know where to place it on the screen and how much space it takes up. And so the 2 algorithms are fixed and auto. And in the fixed case, things are pretty straightforward. It's really clear, the spec. In the auto case, it gives this really awesome algorithm about how to compute the width of, when width is set to auto. And then at the end of that, there's like a sentence that says, hey, I know we gave you this really awesome algorithm, but you don't need to use it. And that's okay, even if you get different results than other browsers. Like, I get the spirit of that, like, hey, be innovative, you may want to do something faster for your particular scenario, et cetera. But ultimately, you as web developers and designers kind of pay for that, right? So if I in Internet Explorer choose something that maybe there's that little bit more performance so that I can display Excel tables better, and another browser manufacturer doesn't do that, and it results in different layout, then it kind of defeated the purpose, right? Like, you wanted us to all do the same thing so that your website looked the same across all the different browsers. So when there are these areas of ambiguity, we look back to this interoperability principle. And we have a set of criteria that we go through to try to resolve these areas that are kind of ambiguous. And this is the criteria. So if the spec calls, hey, do X, hey, we do X. That's pretty straightforward. But if the spec says, you can kind of do what you want, or we're not going to define it, et cetera, then we really look to engage with the W3C. We have active participation on the W3C CSS working group by members of the layout and rendering team. And so we start a conversation, just say, hey, this is the language in the spec. What did you guys mean? What's the right thing for us to do here? And in part of that particular discussion, if it generally goes, hey, what are the other browsers doing? And so we'll actually do an investigation into how the other browsers are implementing or choosing to implement that particular piece of functionality. And we compare that, and we give that information as part of our discussion with the W3C. And so generally, the W3C will say, hey, this is how you should do it. And if they can't, then we'll look at the browser implementations, and we'll try to pick an implementation that gives you the most interoperability across browsers. So like if Firefox and Safari and Opera are clearly doing something one way, and we interpret the spec and we go, probably not. But the goal is interoperability. So chances are really, really good we're implementing it the same way that those other browsers are. And then, when there are these areas of ambiguity and we kind of disagree, again, with the W3C, we're fully capable, and we do submit changes to the spec to try to get the right defined behavior implemented. So kind of without further ado, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about IE8 in action and kind of some of the new stuff that you can do with it now that we've implemented it. The first of these, again, keep in mind this is a beta build, so it's not fully complete yet, but along the way we've implemented several new things. The first of these is a thing called generated content. So the idea here is that this was originally just like a simple list of files, so a doc here, a PowerPoint there, etc. On my music site, I would have loved to have had functionality like this because I had clips that were in AVI format and clips that were in WMV format, etc. And it's just a simple way to kind of add content around that doesn't actually originate from the HTML source to make things more meaningful to the users. So in this particular example, we're adding like the file and path, and we're adding whether it's a Word file or a PowerPoint file, et cetera, et cetera. Just part of the generated content piece. The second is around chapters and sections. And so you can really see the benefit for this anytime you try to edit a page up on Wikipedia, especially longer pages. So like on the top of my Wikipedia article on foo, I've created like this table of contents that says I have sections 1, 2, 3. I go and write my article. A month later, I want to edit it and add a section 2.1. What do? I have to go back to the table of contents and add it in, and then I have to adjust the numbering later on in the document, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea behind these counters is you can use them for blog post counting, which is in my examples later on, or here, just chapter names and numbers, et cetera. Just simple stuff that saves you time. Another thing that's implemented in the beta build is outline. And so, you kind of look at this and go, oh, okay, you have a red box around an input field. I can do that 5 different ways. The nice thing about this particular outline implementation is that it is just purely CSS. Like I don't have to do any scripting or other magic to kind of get this going. And then the second part is that an outline versus the border is that the outline doesn't actually cause a re-layout of the page or a readjustment. It doesn't really take up any space, if you will. And so it's pretty nice functionality. Another thing that folks have been asking for a long time that's actually in the Beta 1 build is the ability to, I'll use the word cast because from my C and C++ background, but it's basically changing the type of a particular object. In this case, it's display type. So normally a table is displayed as a table. In this particular case, I can display this as an inline table. And as you see in the scenario, the idea is that I have a run of text, I have my table, and then I have more run of text, and I want it to all be on the same line, or in line together. And so now you can do display inline table, and other display types as well. Another thing that kind of exists here is around box sizing. And so a little history, I'm sure you guys probably already know this, sorry if I'm repeating, is there were kind of several iterations of this box model, if you will. There was the one that kind of existed and was implemented in Internet Explorer 5.5 and earlier, where it didn't actually take into account like padding, margin, yada, yada, to compute the size of the box. And in the new box model, obviously it does. And there are cases where it may be beneficial when you're designing your site to actually have the old box model instead of the new box model. And so there's a mechanism now to do that within CSS, and we support it. And then the last example here is around vertical text, which is actually something we supported for a while. I'm just calling it out because it's becoming more and more interesting as more and more websites try to do international type stuff. And to kind of finish up on this particular demo, there's I'll just kind of show some of these in action. So this is a quick site that we put together, and it kind of shows some of the generated content piece and the counter piece. So around these posting titles and dates and times, et cetera. So like it's pretty common for you to, I want a post number, so it's post 8, post 7, post 6, post 5, and like who wants to keep track of that and add that into their HTML directly? And so in this particular case, I'm just using counters in order to do that. Same idea with my Daily Awesomeness blog post site, where I only post about awesome things for awesome people. And again, we're using generated content. Again, we're using counters. Again, we also using outline to just call out particular things, et cetera. And I don't want to kind of teach through the CSS here, but there's functionality that you can use in the developer toolbar, and this is kind of a cool place to showcase that. So the developer toolbar gets installed by default. It actually has some CSS functionality built in. So using Shift F12, I can bring that up. And then using this click method, like on click, is basically what it's called, but it allows me to like select an element that's in my page, and I go right to the source for that. So you can see like it highlights different areas of my page, and so I just want to go to here, and it shows me the style, but I can also do trace styles, and it can kind of tell me where the style came from, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see some of the new generated content syntax that's in there. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, and the trace styles functionality is like a lifesaver. Because like when you're trying to answer that question of, okay, where's this thing getting black text from when I told it to be gray? So now you know, right? And you have an easy way to figure that out. Cool. So the backstory about versioning and kind of where this all came from. In our mind, there's always been kind of this opposing force thing around enabling new experiences and providing for site compatibility. And the discussion in our mind kind of went like this. We shipped Internet Explorer 6. We went away for a while. I'm not going to cover why that happened. Anyway, we're back for Internet Explorer 7. We're ready to ship Internet Explorer 7. We're ready to do standards updates for Internet Explorer 7. And we said, wow, if we do these standards mode implementations in the standards mode doc types, we're going to break some stuff. Is that good? We said, probably not, because we're trying to make existing sites just work. But is it bad if we don't do those innovations? Yeah, that's bad as well. So let's do constrained innovation, where we did like some things, but maybe not others, just because of the site compat piece, et cetera. And so in our mind, there was like always this dichotomy. And so the discussion around that previous strategy really fell out from this, right? It was a discussion of which do we need to prioritize? Do we prioritize the new experiences, or do we prioritize existing site compat? And really what we found out is that we don't need to look at these as opposing forces. We need to actually look at these as working in tandem. And so the idea behind the versioning piece is that we had a mechanism to enable the new experiences, and we had a mechanism to enable existing sites to just work. And those principles are maintained even with our current strategy right now. The default is just reversed, right? Before, our default was make existing sites just work, no matter what. And then, yeah, we don't care that you need to push the web forward. You have to opt into this new functionality. And that was bad, right? That wasn't the right decision. And so the new decision is enable the new experiences, push the standards by default, and then still offer this mechanism that allows for compatibility, which is like the second theme of this talk. And that's the existing sites just work piece. So we're preserving some of the modes, if you will, the display modes that we actually had in Internet Explorer 7. And that was kind of part of the contention around the versioning piece. So the Quirks mode remains, right? Like every browser out there today supports some level of Quirks mode. That's the same as everybody else, and the same as we did in previous releases. What's new to this release is that we actually had an IE7 standards mode, and we've versioned that off, if you will, within MS-HTML. We've taken that particular code piece and we've like segmented it and kept it there. And the idea is that on release, we're expecting a good number of sites to not have the opportunity to fully update their site to the new standards compliance. And so we're providing, if you will, a stopgap measure for their sites. It's a way for them to opt in to displaying their site in this IE7 standards mode and limp along while underneath the covers they can go and fix their particular site. Like, we get that. Like, you can't necessarily, everybody can't necessarily switch their site over to the new standards just automatically. And so it's a stopgap measure, and that's why it still exists. I also want to point out that this is not side-by-side type functionality. This actually isn't complete mirroring of the IE7 standards mode, because there's other elements to it, not just the CSS layout piece, but a networking stack and a parser and all of those other things. But we've actually done our very, very best, honestly, our very best, not to put fixes or other things into this IE7 standards mode that would break it. And our bar is really, really high for that. there are a class of fixes that we will make to IE7 standards mode, and we understand that that may break sites and compatibility. And those generally fall into the buckets of either performance or security, and mostly the latter. So if there's a critical security fix or whatever, we will make that fix to IE7 standards mode. Security trumps everything else, even if it might cause some sites to break. So I want to talk a little bit about this version targeting and basically how it works. So back to my example of my site. So this was the site, again, that I had created in Internet Explorer 7, and that it worked just fine in Internet Explorer 7. And now in Internet Explorer 8 in standards mode, because of the way that the conditional comments were authored, et cetera, I'm getting styles now that are just not going to work when I'm trying to display this page in the most standards mode way as possible. And so I actually have two different ways to fix this particular page. The first is I can use the meta tag to lock in to that IE7 standards mode. And the way that that works is that the meta tag string here, I can add that to my page, save this, do a refresh. And so now my page displays in that IE7 standards mode functionality. And of course, it's a stopgap. And again, if I remove it, I am broken. The second thing that we can do to kind of mitigate things is this button that you see on the toolbar. So for the beta, it's still undecided whether or not we'll have this at RTM, but for the beta especially, we have this whole Emulate IE7 button. And the button, among other things, controls that IE7 standards mode engine and locking into that. And I'll get to your question at the end if that's okay. Of course, the better way to actually fix this problem is to just define a standard site across the board that works in all the different browsers. And so I did just that. I actually did write CSS once that works the same in Internet Explorer 8 and Firefox and Opera and Safari. It's the same code. I can share it with you after if you'd like. So this gets to the whole versioning architecture piece. And so again, we do have these three modes, right? We have the IE, I'll call it less than or equal to 6 mode. That's our quirks mode. We have the new IE7 standards mode. That's the piece that we've versioned off. And then we have the brand new IE8 mode that is our most standards compliant piece. And again, the IE8 mode is the default. The IE7 mode may be opted into. So a little bit about how this works and how we arrived at the meta tag. We actually had many heated debates around the ways to implement this doc type and version targeting. Among the options were conditional comments, some other particular HTML tags, and finally we arrived at the meta tag. And the reason for that is really twofold. The first is the spirit really behind the meta tag is that there's a contract between the client and then the server or the content that's hosted on the server where you can pass information about information. That's the meta piece. Information about my document. That's really meaningless to other browsers, but the contract is that both the client and the server or the content on the server knows how to interpret this data. And we see this in place today. The meta tag is used for all sorts of things like search tags, et cetera. And we used it for the doc type in this version mode opt-in, if you will, and opt-out. The second reason that we chose the meta tag and the particular implementation that we did had to do with you could also reuse this as part of an HTTP header. And so the idea here is that there's really two ways for you to opt in your document structure. One model says, go to every single page that you serve up and then add this tag to lock in maybe IE7 standards behavior. It works pretty well if you don't have a lot of pages. And The other model is if I just want to opt in an entire site, because of this particular syntax, I can use an HTTP header on my server, and then thus all of my pages then get that. So a little bit about how all of this stuff fits together. The tag that comes via HTTP, think of that as kind of highest. It can be overridden by a meta tag in the document itself. So like on the server, you could say, I want the header to be IE7 standards. So this is the stopgap piece, right? Like my entire site, I know it works today at IE7. I use an HTTP header. Poof, my site still works with IE8 clients. They're just displaying it as would IE7 clients. And then I go page by page and I say, hey, I want to update this page to standards mode. How do I do that? So on that particular page, I'd relay out the page to be standards compliant, and I could use this meta tag to declare it to be shown in IE8 standards mode. And so the client, again, via the HTTP request would say, oh, the doc's IE7. No, when I get the page says IE8. IE8 it is. And so it gets that standards mode compliant piece. And then after you've updated your entire site, you could remove the HTTP header and remove the targeting that are in the regular documents, and we'll just display them all as standards mode by default. So these are the compatibility mode values. There's an IE5 one, IE7, IE8, the IE Edge one, which is largely kind of academic at this point, since by default we're always trying to render in the most standards mode, so there's really no use for the Edge, though it's already there. And the script here at the bottom just kind of shows that you can check the mode of the document via JavaScript. So here's the meta tag opt-in syntax and how that works. I've included it in the page here. The keys are the placement of that meta tag within the document. So the spec says that the meta stuff should all be in the head. It needs to be in the head. If you put it somewhere else, we're not going to honor it. The second thing has to do with like the ordering of where that meta tag needs to be. It should be, like title can be before it and other meta tags should be before it. Like I wouldn't try to hide it way low in the header. Otherwise, it might not get parsed correctly. And so, I talked a little bit about this version targeting and kind of how that works already. I probably will just skip over this. I do want to talk a little bit about compatibility challenges and how that piece works. So despite kind of all the layout structure that we've talked about, there are two other areas where we largely see site compatibility issues. The first is in user agent sniffing. And yeah, we can debate the merits and whether it's good or bad, mostly bad to do user agent sniffing, et cetera. But the fact is it does exist today, and it exists on some really high-profile sites, again, as I'll show you in my demo in just a second. And so the key here is that, one, in your user agent string, you need to account for Internet Explorer 8. And so Internet Explorer 8 is actually reporting itself as Internet Explorer 8, regardless of the document mode or layout mode or anything like that. When we first do that connection to the site, it's kind of the chicken and, it's not even a chicken and egg problem. Like you have to know up front like what the browser supports in order to give it the right document. So when you do that initial HTTP request, we will say we're Internet Explorer 8. And then we could get back an Internet Explorer 8 version doc or a standards mode doc or an IE7 standards doc or a quirks mode doc, et cetera. But we are going to report ourselves as IE8 by default. And so if you're doing user agent sniffing, obviously in the first example when you're doing some type of exact comparison, obviously 8 does not equal 7, and so you might not get the correct content. So better to use the greater than or equal to piece. The second point around this user agent sniffing is that make sure that you're giving Internet Explorer 8 the correct doc type that you think. So in my example here, if in this if block, I was actually giving it, standards mode content or something, but I was trying to handle that same doc for both IE7 and IE8, that would probably be bad, right? IE8 would handle that standards mode doc. IE7 wouldn't know how to display it because it's not as standards compliant. That would be badness as well. So if you're doing user agent sniffing, make sure that you're handing back the doc type that you intend to back to the browser. The second piece is around conditional comments. And so this gets a little complicated, but the premise and the main thing to kind of remember is that Internet Explorer 8 also revs the conditional comments value. So the way that conditional comments work is that there is an internal structure called version vector, which is really just a reg key under HKLM software, Microsoft Internet Explorer. So there's a version vector key, and that's like our internal version, if you will, of Internet Explorer. When we look and we encounter a conditional comments block, we check the value in that conditional comments block. So in this example, if less than or equal to IE7, we take that 7 and compare it to the version vector that's in the registry to figure out whether we evaluate to true or we evaluate to false. So that's the way that works. And the version vector is actually getting revved to 8 with Internet Explorer 8. So, again, you need to make sure that Internet Explorer 8 is accounted for in your conditional comments, and you should make sure that your logic is correct in the sense that you're handing Internet Explorer 8 the intended doc type. And so that's what actually broke one of my previous demos, the one of my guitar page, and why it worked in Internet Explorer 7 and then it didn't work in Internet Explorer 8. I was using this if greater than or equal to IE7 syntax, but I was passing it this style sheet that assumed fix-ups were required for Internet Explorer in order to display the page correctly. And those fix-ups aren't necessary in standards mode, which was the doc type of the document. And so thus the page just wasn't displaying correctly. So this kind of talks to those compatibility pieces. So I do want to show a little bit about site compatibility and the challenges here. So the first site that I'm showing, and again, I apologize if anybody works on these sites directly, is AOL. And I hope I didn't want to click on any links on this left bar, because that didn't work out so well. So what's happening here is that AOL is doing user agent sniffing. And when I come in as Internet Explorer 8, in its user agent sniffing, it just says for 7 and above, give it X styles. It gives us those styles, but the document type is a standards mode doc type. So we're getting fix-ups that we don't need. Thus, the page looks like this. Another favorite site of mine is Newegg. I go here all the time to buy hardware. And so in Newegg's particular case, they kind of have a similar problem, and their menu system is a little broken. Like the site is still completely usable, just a little off. But regardless, some type of fix-up is still required in order to support Internet Explorer 8 correctly. Another site here is the Washington Post. So back to my discussion about modes, and that in that IE8 mode, there's other things that are enabled besides just layout. There's new JavaScript functionality. There's new object model functionality. In this case, we've actually fixed some of the problems associated with get element by ID. Again, I won't go into them in this session. They are covered in detail in tomorrow's session. But those are now fixed. And this page is using JavaScript for its menus. And because of the fix in the get element by ID, you can see that I can't even navigate the menu system at all. And the way that it should look is that like I should be able to highlight these particular links again. So get element by ID is broken, and so the menu system is broken. The same idea happens on Tom's Hardware. So I go to Tom's Hardware to try to read up on my hardware reviews to make my purchase over there at Newegg. And again, there's this particular part of the page that is displaying like common articles, like whatever's hot that day, is also broken because of the get element by ID fixes. So JavaScript fixes may also play into things. And then the last is around user agent sniffing again. Let's see. I'll try to sign in. Oh, awesome. Yeah, again, your browser's not officially supported. So again, they're just doing user agent string sniffing, and they haven't yet accounted for Internet Explorer 8. They're just bucketizing all the stuff that's unknown into this, oh, you're kind of unsupported right now bucket. And actually, even Yahoo's front page used to do this, and they've since updated their site. I think the mail thing is actually the last thing that they have to update. So the point is that, and kind of the call to action really is that please take a look at your site and test it with Internet Explorer 8 and realize that some of those assumptions you made about Internet Explorer not being standards compliant or not adhering to these particular things aren't true anymore in Internet Explorer 8. And make sure that you're passing Internet Explorer 8 the content that you really intended to. So just to kind of sum up what we talked about today, there was this discussion on interoperability. It was the premise of I should be able to create a site once and then have that design work across all of the different browsers. It's as simple as that. The second was around compatibility and version targeting. And that was the story about how we provide a stopgap measure so that when we actually release Internet Explorer 8, if you haven't had a chance to update your site yet to standards mode content, you have a way to become unbroken. And that's, again, via the meta tag. And then on the end user side, for the beta at least, there's the button that allows you to switch and toggle back to IE7 mode. And then last but not least, we talked about the new scenarios, stuff like outline and counters and generated content that are now enabled in the beta. So I encourage you, create some pages that do that. Start testing out that functionality and thinking about ways that you could leverage that functionality on your site. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for attending. I really appreciate it. Cool. I'll take questions too if you guys want to stick around.
And the new layout component, I don't know if it has a name or not. Two questions. One is, when you go into the compatibility mode, is it actually MS-HTML that renders the page, or are you emulating it? And secondly, is the new layout engine available to as a component to application developers in the same way that MS-HTML has been in the past? And if so, what information is on these kind of API it supports?
Sure. So the first question was around, is it still MS-HTML that's kind of doing the rendering? Yes, it is still MS-HTML. The code name is still Trident. And it's just like two different code paths within an MS-HTML, if you will. So it is still that. The second question, I believe, was around people that are hosting MS-HTML like in their app. And so that is one difference in terms of the opt-in versus the by default behavior, is that there are so many apps today, even in the Windows system, like Windows Overall Help, that assume a particular set of layout. And so for hosted Trident, it will maintain that IE7 compatibility. And that's no change that we've had from all of our previous releases of Internet Explorer. And you can opt in to the new IE8 behavior as a hosted application.
So if it's still MS-HTML, there's two code paths within it. In what sense have you started from scratch?
So, yeah, sorry, there are three code paths for the quirks piece as well. But the sense of from scratch is that the pipeline goes, we do parsing of the HTML, we create a document tree, which is our object model. From the object model, then we do layout, which is like a whole separate piece within there. So now the layout for one piece, well, really two quirks and the IE7 standards goes one area, and then the piece for IE8 goes completely different. And the underlying technology that we use there to do that layout is also completely different. So that's the piece that was sort of started from scratch. It's all MS-HTML.dll. Hi.
So you talked about three different code paths, and on the slide it said that they were corresponding to IE5, 7, and 8. Is there a technical reason that 6 wasn't included, or you just don't like it?
Well, there is the I don't like it piece. But yeah, I mean, it was probably just an inconsistency on my part in the slides. Like one part actually had it as being like 6 and less than. So. But
I mean, is it going to be possible, maybe using the meta tag? Have you considered?
I see. You want to target into Internet Explorer 6 as well.
My company, whose name I won't mention because I'm about to say something embarrassing about them, is pretty big.
And they're tied to Internet Explorer 6 behavior. Yeah, I think
they actually have not upgraded to IE7 yet. Okay. Like 2 years later.
Yeah. Well, I will flog you after. But for now, yeah, I think that's kind of the functionality behind that quirks doc type. So, and there are like Google today still uses the Quarks mode doc type, right? So like there are sites today that still do Quarks mode. I think that's a perfect case for you to continue to use Quarks mode doc types. Thanks. Any other questions? Darn you, no hard questions. I'm just kidding. So the question was about ACID 3, and it was just released, and kind of what's our story for supporting that. How should I put this? I'll be pretty candid. I don't think that we'll probably end up supporting it completely by the time Internet Explorer 8 is released. Part of that has to do with where we're at in the cycle and whether or not we could actually finish it and still get a product out in our time. And then the second is around resources and where they're allocated on the team. Again, like back to my car example, like there's so many different standards that are out there that kind of make up the car, right? Like besides just the fuel piece, there's like safety standards, emission standards, how wide is the car, does it fit on the road, et cetera. And there's the same idea within the browser space. There's SV, just to handle a couple that I'm sure are coming as well, SVG and HTML5 and CSS3 and et cetera, and DOM level 2. Like where did we focus our efforts? And in the layout piece, we focused our efforts on CSS 2.1. And I know for a fact there are elements of that ACID 3 test that tests some stuff from CSS 3, and it's not just layout pieces, et cetera. So, hi.
I have a question about your last slide with those 3 bullet points.
Sure.
If you could go to it for a sec. Doesn't the third one in some ways contradict the first two, in the sense that if there are new scenarios and new IE8 specific things that only will work in IE8, if you as a web developer put that into your application or into your web app, how will those get exposed, and how will they look in Firefox and other browsers?
Yeah, there's an argument that circles on the web about progressive enhancement and about basically ways to take advantage of stuff that's in browsers today and that might come about to be supported in the future. And so we kind of subscribe to that in the sense, and that you may be able to, like, say, use generated content in one particular case, and then it might not look as pretty in other browsers until they actually implement that. So that's like one case where, like, I don't think it would be the end of the world if you didn't have that functionality in the other browsers, but it would make the experience better in a browser that did support it. So like it doesn't make your page completely useless, I guess. And the other is that for those new scenarios, like those things are actually to some specification, whether it's CSS 2.1 or the drafts of the CSS 3, et cetera, et cetera. And so like from that perspective, like I'd say that those things that we did go after are safer to implement, like, because the assumption again is that most other browsers would support them.
So the new scenarios will eventually move themselves into the standards and become...
They're already there in the standards. And the pieces that actually are not like technically part of a standard, like the standard defines, like if you implement properties that aren't there, you should prefix them with some proprietary prefix. So like ours that are implemented that way have like -ms in front of them, et cetera.
Thanks.
Sure. Hi.
Hi there. Is there any chance that IE8 will include CSS3 media queries?
Is there any chance? There's a possibility, I'd say, but I'd probably say pretty slim.
Okay.
I can talk to you afterwards, though. I'm interested in kind of knowing, like, why. So, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah. Several of them, are part of the beta directly and do get the releases ahead of time. There is a pretty big partner outreach program, which includes 5,000 or so, at least for the first beta, large content providers plus other people that create toolkits, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but I mean, it is a focus, right? Like the whole community kind of needs to move forward, so. Yeah.
Do you plan to support HTML5?
For this particular release, probably not, no. Any other questions? I'll hang around afterwards, too, if you want to. Yes?
So I noticed one site was Washington Post, I think. It was broken in IE8, but it was still working fine
do you
Yeah,
think that was?
it's just another case of a site trying to anticipate that there were fix-ups that are specific to IE. That was the discussion before about whether or not we could just turn on standards and not have any breakage, because there was this assumption that so many sites were designed for Firefox and it was more standards compliant than we were. And the reality is that there are plenty of sites out there today that actually hand different content to the different browsers. So the content that Firefox gets is different on the Washington Post site than the content that Internet Explorer gets.
So you think if you were to emulate Firefox's user agent, you would have,
Yeah, and it works the other way around as well. Like how I could find these sites that are busted, I modified Firefox's user agent to say that it was Internet Explorer 8, and I started getting all these bad pages. That's how I could tell whether or not it was, because we're still in beta, right, and there's bugs in the product. Like I could tell whether the site was broken because of a bug in our beta or because it was just getting bad content. And that's how I found that site and a bunch of others. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for attending. I appreciate it.